Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about things that I don't actually usually get to talk about, but that I've spent the better part of my life trying to figure out, which should be considered a due warning, because I can geek out on this entire topic immensely. I do have a clock up here, and I will stop myself because my dear friend and partner in crime, Michael McAfee, will be the next keynote, and I would not want you to not have your time, so that's the only real stop I have. So my name is Mette Boell. I introduced myself before, I believe. I am the co-director and the research director of this lab here at MIT, the Systems Awareness Lab, and I'm also the co-founder along with Peter and the executive director for our Center for Systems Awareness. If all else fails, at least I have that. I've been on a kind of a quest for most of my life trying to figure out what's going on. And this has led me to this place today. And I stand here not just as a scientist, I'm a biologist, I am deeply interested in trying to understand living processes. And I've always been, like, literally for as long as I can remember, baffled why we operate like we do when clearly we're consistently producing outcomes that is not beneficial for humans or the planet. And I've never understood why. So I stand here not just as a scientist and a kind of a proud research director of this new lab, and with the tremendous joy and opportunity to work with so many of you doing really meaningful work. But I also stand here as a concerned citizen. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I really deeply worry about the world that my grandbabies are growing up in. Because we seem to be on a track or a trajectory that is leading very rapidly off the cliff. And I'm not particularly fond of doomsday theories. I'm also mindful that we've had doomsday theories throughout the history of human beings, probably. But the collective, accumulative effects of our actions over the last couple of 100 years does not look good for the thrival and survival of our species. And I can say that as a biologist because I look at living systems and I notice how, dramatically we're producing these extinction rates, for example, which will eventually lead to collapse of ecosystems. And how that impacts us is, beyond measure of anything we've ever seen in the world before. And this is part of why I'm so dedicated to this work, and part of why, I'm sure as many of you can testify, I come across as a little bit of a workaholic, because I'm actually really deeply concerned about these matters. And I'm grateful, truly, tremendously grateful, to have the opportunity to stand here today and actually try in exploration and joint kind of process with you all to figure out how we might start to do things differently. And why education, you might ask? I don't have a deep background in education as such. Of course, I'm the product of a lot of education, but trust me, that did not go down as it was intended to most of the time, and I got kicked out of pretty much all schools I ever went to. So why am I working in the field of education? Well, I'm working in the field of education because for the last many hundred years, super well-educated individuals, mainly men, have made decisions that have led us to the place where we are now. That's some shitty decision-making, a lot of it, because it led us to this place where we are now. So clearly something has to change in education in order for us to change the trajectory. And it's by far the highest leverage, as I can see, and Peter and I talk about this often, because we don't have to unlearn a whole lot of things as adults to begin to show up differently if we actually learn how to be flourishing and thriving human beings, caring human beings from the onset on. And the other part, of course, is I care about the kids. Not just my kids and the offsprings of my kids, but all the kids. I care that they will be vulnerable in the times of great breakdowns. We're confronted with these breakdowns on an everyday basis. We have a lot of people here from California. Some of the people from California that were supposed to come couldn't come because of the dramatic weather events in California right now. And who's to protect the kids? Who's to take care of making sure that our kids will be okay, that they'll be attended to with the needs that they have when these breakdowns occur? That's another reason why we're working in education. So, despite this somehow gloomy offset, I do want to say that this sense of optimism, hope, and gratitude comes from the kind of work that I am able to be involved in with many of you, because it's amazing to see what human beings are capable of when we come together with a kind of a shared aspiration for changing things towards greater kindness and greater kind of clarity. And that's the kind of theme that we're somehow working with in this. I've tried to say, well, you know, we'll work towards a methodology for systems awareness, but as much as I would like to say that I've got this one nailed, I really don't, because it's a big, vast territory and it's novel. We don't really know how to do these things. We have good ideas, and based on all the work that we've been involved with the Compassionate Systems Framework over the last decade or so, we have great indicators of what needs to happen in order for things to begin to change. But obviously, we need to study that much more rigorously. And that's the opportunity that we have with this new lab now. And I'm really excited about that, because in whatever little way I can hopefully contribute to creating different pathways than the ones we're staring at right now, that will be, you know, the finest thing I can think of doing in this lifetime. So we talk about systems awareness in a particular way in this framework, in the Compassionate Systems Framework, which is the work that, when Peter was referring to, you know, the archetypes and so on, is the work that we've collectively created. So we've developed a mandala called a Systems Awareness Mandala. And what does that mean? Well, a mandala basically means a circle with a center. And it's a kind of a way in many different traditions of depicting or holding the whole. So we've developed this model. But the act of systems awareness, the cultivation of systems awareness, really comes through what we might call contemplative interoception. Of course, I'm using terminology like this because we're at MIT. We're supposed to have fancy lingo. But what that basically means is exactly what the little process we were engaging in before. Contemplative, which means basically a kind of a grounded inward focus, trying to rest and calm our minds. And then we begin to notice what's showing up in me in a kind of a systematic way, so that we don't just are reactive to our inner impulses, but that we begin to cultivate a relationship with whatever is moving in us, so that we can have more choice in how we want to show up. And we can somehow map that or develop a rigorous process of cultivating different facets of awareness, so that we become a lot better at this. And with the Systems Awareness Mandala, we can start with perceptual awareness. So this whole notion of everything that's coming in through our senses, we can attend to that. This is, in this domain, perceptual awareness, all stuff that has to do with mindfulness, with focus, with concentration, with beginning to discern what am I experiencing from the outside, and to process that, not just become overwhelmed with it. That's what lives and resides in this domain of perceptual awareness. The next one is somatic awareness. Somatic is everything that has to do with the body. And that's vastly underestimated in most of our traditions, in most of the ways we live our lives. Because this orientation inwardly to what are the impulses that are arising, What is happening in me right now? All emotions arise within this domain. They're physiological phenomena, and then we apply meaning to it and become, or we do that subconsciously and become really reactive. We can have ways of beginning to understand what's going on the inside that will allow us to make choices about how we want to show up, and when we're with other people. So this whole notion of somatic awareness is much older than the perceptual awareness. The particular areas of the brain that are involved in perceptual awareness are much newer, the frontal cortex, areas of the frontal cortex and so on. With the somatic awareness, we have much older areas, like this whole orientation to the field, temperature, touch, all of those things that comes through kind of evolutionarily speaking, are much older faculties of the brains that are involved, of the brain that's involved. And the next one is aspirational awareness. And we might talk about aspirational awareness as, in the way we usually describe it is, what are we seeking to grow? What would we like to see happen? And think about the reality that most of us exist in. It's like a whack-a-mole, right? It's like constantly putting out fires, all the stuff we don't want, right? So there's a lot of attention to this thing is happening and I don't want that to happen. Now, our brains are really not very good with the term don't, and we can test that very easily. I can tell you to do not think of an orange elephant. How many of you now have kind of an image of an orange elephant in your brains? The only thing the brain hears is orange elephant, comes on afterwards, and we don't operate well with negations like that. So when we're talking about aspirational awareness, it's different from stuff we don't want. It's focusing on leaning into the kind of reality we would like to see. What are we seeking to grow? What will we aspire to have come out of this? This is a vastly underestimated territory for most of us. And sadly so, even in education, of course, what would happen if we had this conversation with our kids from they were very young? What would you like to grow? Who do you aspire to be? And so on and so forth. It's very different from a college to career readiness. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate education, obviously, but the whole notion of having to accomplish some kind of external goal and that's the purpose of education, we see how kids are suffering in college, right? We see how hard it is for people to find their way. And part of this is because we've lost kind of a sense of what's my purpose? What's my sense of direction? What am I supposed to do in this lifetime? We use a cookie-cutter model on the unique experience of each and every human being, and it's just failing us dramatically. And the last one is relational awareness. And that, of course, has to do with the sense of care and how we relate to each other, our empathy and compassion, but also how we're, navigating life in many ways, how we're kind of relating outwardly, generally speaking, our outlook on life, how are we feeling about the reality that we exist in. And not too surprisingly, there's a huge correlation between people who have a very negative outlook on life and people who suffer from anxiety, depression, stress, and so on. This is not too surprising. If I'm constantly threatened by the world that I operate in, it's very overwhelming and overpowering, and it's hard to then somehow come to a place where I can be at ease, I can feel good about things, I can hope and aspire and dream and think that I have stuff to do in this world. And in part, and I want to just kind of get back to that, in part is because we're lacking this systems awareness perspective. Now, what does that mean? Well, in some ways, we're now talking about the different kind of portals or aspects of awareness that feeds into systems awareness, what we call systems awareness. But if we think about, how how we've somehow deteriorated away from, our senses have deteriorated away from having a kind of a more spacious sense of who we are and where we belong and being part of, the living systems and so on. It's this whole trajectory that has led to the kinds of educational outcomes that we're seeing today is a trajectory that is, based on a dominance model of what nature is, of wanting to control and understand, a lack of understanding that we are living systems that arose out of the other living systems, and that there's part of us that is profoundly interconnected to all the other living systems that we're part of. We're a deeply social species. And now when we don't have that sense of connection to the planet we live on and come out of, to the living systems we're part of, to the other species, or even the other people around us, of course we become anxious and stressed out and depressed. Because here I am, like a social species. We see that in all other social species. If they're excluded from their packs, if they're not part of the natural environment that they evolved to belong to, they freak out. They lose a sense of context and meaning. And so a lot of what we're seeing today in the declining mental health and well-being in our students, in our educators, and people in general, but of course most importantly in our students, probably comes out of this. And practically speaking, we can talk about ways that it's weird. Think about if you creep up to a fly or butterfly or cat or mouse or a bird. They'll immediately sense you in the field. It's not because they hear you, not necessarily because they scent you, but because they're attuned to their environment. That is a sense that has deteriorated entirely for us, which is why we get like spooked out if somebody comes creeping up behind us. We're supposed to have some level of orientation to the field we're in. That's part of what it means being a living being, an organism, and part of what it means operating in a social field. So as this deterioration has happened, because we've been so focused on our kind of visual sense, and also because we've lost touch with what it means to be part of the living systems. We don't really experience that a whole lot when we grow up in cities like this one, or even the larger ones. Like I was recently in Jakarta, for example. There's very little opportunity to engage in a meaningful way with, what a living ecosystem is like. And it's hard for us to then somehow have to learn that later on in life, if we have the opportunity to go out and connect and so on, because there's a lot of a kind of a baseline learning and understanding of what it's like being human that's just hasn't really been saturated at that level. And now, part of what we've come to discuss, we had a kind of a design meeting for this whole process in September with a lot of the folks that are in the room. And this whole process, what I mean is we have the opportunity to now enter into the next phase of the work in California, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But, really talking about, so what is it that we do? Why is this so important? And if we want to translate it into kind of everyday terminology, we want to cultivate clarity, and we want to cultivate kindness. Now, of course, we can't know if this will actually lead to the compassionate systems change that we're aspiring to, but we can sure as hell know that it's not going to harm anyone. So at least it's worth a try. Because the sense of cultivating clarity, well, has to do with this systems awareness mandala. The clarity of, okay, I actually experience what's coming in through my senses, and I have some level of reflective learning with that. I experience all the impulses that arise in my body, and I have some level of understanding of my mapping of my inner landscape, some level of literacy with what's evoked in me in different situations. I have an understanding of what I aspire to see in the world. And I know how I can show up with people in a way that, bears this quality of kindness, which, by the way, will make me feel a lot better as well. It's not just for the sake of others, but the more we operate with altruism, with kindness, with care, the better we feel about ourselves. So there's a kind of a direct, correlation, if you will, between the somatic and the relational into the kindness aspect, because we all actually need to cultivate this stance of kindness with ourselves. Otherwise, we're not particularly good at doing it with others, because we tend to not be entirely real about what's going on in us, and then we show up in ways that we think are the most productive ways, but it doesn't always work out. I'm sure we all have lived experiences of that, like when we overextend ourselves because we think it's more important how other people feel than how we feel. And I'm not talking about, a self-absorbed kind of narcissistic orientation. I'm talking about taking seriously that this embodiment is an equal part of the system that we're all part of. So me attending to people out there, while not attending to me, is still creating a kind of a discrepancy in the system, if you will. So this, taking seriously that we operate in equal basis with everyone else in the system, is part of what's included in this somatic awareness. And the clarity perspective, well, I take in what's coming through my senses, and I have some level of reflection on that, so I don't get completely overwhelmed. And overwhelm is a natural state, by the way, because we're in a complete state of information overload, all of us at all times. Our brains have not evolved to deal with all of this. And so part of the reason why we're doing all these reflective practices and trying to ground ourselves and trying to make choices about where I want to place my attention and so on, is because it's the only way scientifically we know how to counterbalance this sense of information overload. Now, if I'm a constant state of information overload, my anxiety levels are bound to increase. So I need to have some way of operating in a meaningful way that can somehow counterbalance that. Chances are social media is not going to go anywhere. Our emails are not going to go anywhere. I wish they would, but they don't. and we just have to figure out ways of navigating this incredible complexity of stimulants that is coming our way every single day at all times. Probably some of you even have your phones vibrating in the pocket as it is right now because, oh my God, yet another alert is happening. And it happens to all of us all the time. And we have not evolved to deal with that. So we need to figure out ways in which we can help ourselves to apply some kind of reflective stance to this situation that we find ourselves in. So one of the things, of course, that we aspire to do is, we should actually probably have a little term here, Field for Compassionate Systems Change. We have this mandala for systems change, and many of you, of course, know this model, and for some of you, it'll be completely novel. So we aspire to create change. How do we know it's going to be change over time? We don't. It's really hard to study something and then say, oh, in about 20 years' time, this is what it's going to look like. Because, life happens in the meantime. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum of this, systems change has become like a complete fad. And everybody and his brother is doing systems change processes. I have a slight arrogance towards this, as you might be able to tell. Because I think that people underestimate what it actually takes. And actually, we were in a conversation with people from the Carnegie Corporation the other day and just talking about this. So how come that there's been so many amazing initiatives by really well-intended, clever people that's been funded with millions of dollars all over the world to produce different outcomes in education, and so little of it has had any significant impact? The places where it has impact is usually based on individuals that are carrying this work, and once these individuals leave the work, it somehow crumbles. It doesn't become a self-sustaining change effort over time. If it had worked, our kids would probably be doing a lot differently than they are right now, and our educators too. So what's that? What's up with that? It's not because it's, people who don't care about creating these outcomes. I mean, I'm sure most people are as deeply invested in this as I stand here in front of you today, and as I know so many of you in the room are as well. So why is that? And one of the things that we talk about with this Field for Systems Change is what we can grow. And what we're aspiring to grow is systems change, or compassionate systems change. In most settings, of course, we talk about scalability And it's important to understand, I think, at least from my perspective, that living systems can't be scaled. You wouldn't want to scale your crops. Nobody would even take you seriously if you tried to scale your carrots in your little garden at home. But you can grow things. So our orientation to what that takes needs to have that kind of perspective of it's a living system. It works in different ways than a mechanical system. You can know what you're planting, the kind of seeds that you're planting, and we're planting the seeds for compassionate systems change. You can think about the nutrients that will be needed in the soil for this to grow appropriately, care, attention, clarity, so on. You can't control the circumstances, the weather if you want, all the different things that are happening around people, around the world, for many of you people in the localities. We can't control that at all. But what we can know is there has to be some level of capacity building. Well, what's that? Some ways for us to understand things a little differently, learn new techniques. That's basically what we do through the Center for Systems Awareness with our introductory workshops, with our Master Practitioner program, and so on. We try to introduce systems thinking tools and practices, contemplative tools and practices, and so on, so that we develop that capacity. But then, of course, we have to, practice this also. So it has to be applied into a practical setting, because otherwise it's just sitting there, right? Like all the PDs people go to, and then they come back and they're like, that was really wonderful, I want to do that, but it never really kind of gets integrated into my everyday life. And so it doesn't live or grow in any way. And then, if people start practicing different skill sets, it's not going to do very much. So we have to have some sense of a community that can come together and grow these things collectively. And then there's the research area. And of course, today we stand here because we're deeply invested in exploring this research area much more systematically than we've ever been able to before. But research is in the broadest sense here, not just the stuff that can take place in an institution like MIT, but also our everyday reflective stance. What am I learning? What am I understanding? What seems to work? What doesn't seem to work? So back to what Eric was talking about before. This is not about us coming and kind of doing an analysis of everything that's going on, but people engaging in a shared kind of journey of trying to understand what we're learning, what's working, what's not working, how does it make me feel, how am I showing up with this? And you can see there's some kind of circular momentum here, because this research, of course, will immediately feed into how we develop and grow the capacity building. So we're not in a kind of a fixed state. And that, over time, can grow compassionate systems change. Now, the systems awareness part, people will often ask, how does that relate to these domains for systems change? Why is it important that we talk about systems awareness in this perspective? And the best way I can think to illustrate it is, well, the systems awareness has to be somehow integral in each of the 4 domains of change, because otherwise we'll just one more time step into the assumption that things are going to shift without we shifting our orientation to things. And this is what it all comes down to, basically. The primary unit, if you will, the primary entity of any systems change is this embodied existence. How I show up, how I relate to things, how I connect with other people, how I conduct myself. If that doesn't change, if I can't reorient myself, I'm not going to be able to produce any change outwardly. And I think back to the conversation we had with the Carnegie folks is that's exactly the missing point. Now, why is that a missing point? Well, a couple of ideas, at least. One is we have probably historically low literacy on everything that has to do with what it means to be a human being, like in a deeper sense. We don't have a good language for understanding, oh, okay, so I'm impacted in this particular way and these emotions show up and now, you are triggering me and I don't know how to deal with that and all these things. We just don't know very much about that. probably, and this is an assumption on my part, when we were tribal, we had to figure it out because we were deeply dependent on the well-being of the system around us, our group, our pack, our people around us. So we had to somehow live in a different way, understanding how I show up impacts the other people around me. And oh, by the way, how they show up actually impacts me, impacts my well-being, my capacity to function, to be of service to the group. There's very little of that orientation, generally speaking, in our modern cultures. So the systems awareness part basically sits in each of the 4 domains of systems change, which is why it's a kind of a precondition for figuring out how to produce this change. And I'm behind closed door, just between us. I think that most people who engage in systems change processes somehow try to evade this part because it's damn hard. We don't know very much about what it takes. It even has the kind of label on it that it's the soft skills. And I'm like, now that gets my arrogance rising because I'm like, you surely have never tried doing any of this, because I can tell you I'll choose math and science any old day, the so-called hard skills, because this is really hard work. We have to confront ourselves. We have to figure out who we are, how we're impacting people, how we're operating out of our biases, how we're not showing up as we think we're showing up because other people actually perceive us differently. That is very hard work. It's very confrontational. Now, of course, if we learned this in school, if this was part of our general education, it would probably be very different. Because now it's just a way in which we come to understand what it means to be a human being. So in this whole cultivating clarity and kindness, we have these individuals. So the individuals, there had to be a stick figure somewhere, of course. So these individuals are, we have to work with ourselves, understanding our own inner system, if you will. But we are directly connected to the social system. We're part of the social system, we are impacting the social system as we show up, and we are impacted by the social system. And we are also actually directly in exchange with the larger systems, if you will, our globe, our institutions, our way in which we organize societies. We're directly impacted by that, obviously through policies, through decision-making, and so on and so forth, but also in our choices of how we show up as citizens. We're impacting the global climate, for example. All of us are. Even those of us who wish that we could do things better, we're somehow stuck in this predicament that we're contributing to outcomes that we would really like to not be contributing to. And so we have to get quite real about that. That's where the clarity part comes in. It's not enough just wanting good things. We have to have some level of rigor with how we begin to assess and determine what actually works. What do we need to do? How do we need to shift ourselves so that we can change the dynamics of the social systems and change the dynamics of the larger systems? That's somehow a kind of a deeply personal and totally collective endeavor for all of us. So I have another thing that I discovered when I started working in education. I'm just going to look at the time here. People like talking about ecosystems. And I like being really arrogant about people talking about ecosystems because I'm a real biologist, right? And the thing is, I'm not trying to, let me be a little more adult about this. I think that there are ways in which we are talking about ecosystems that is missing the point entirely. Because we tend to map out the system and then think we're somehow capturing the ecosystem, but we forget all the microbes in the soil and the micronutrients and the fungi and everything that's also going on, all the stuff that's kind of passing through and so on. So I've really been thinking about this, and I was actually thinking, Sophie, for like 1,000 years ago at Stewart Foundation, there was a kind of a prototype of this presentation happening, and everybody was like, yeah, great, what are we going to do about that? I think we've now come to a point where we know something about what to do with it. So this is the continuation, part 2. It's like, because, we talk about ecosystems of education, and we can be quite, rigorous about, well, we have society and we have families. And then, of course, there are parents and children in those families. And these children are also students, and they are somehow, in relation to teachers in the classroom. And the teachers, of course, also belong to the families. And then the classrooms are part of a school. And there's the outer school. Can't forget expanded learning in this context now, can we? And that stands in relation to each other. And there are the districts. And then, of course, there are the counties. And the counties are in relation to the outer school and directly to the school and to the districts and so on and so forth. And then there's the state or the country or the province, whatever the larger entity is. And that's also in relation to a lot of these different things. So no wonder that we think that we put all these causal loop diagrams together and now we're mapping the ecosystem of education, right? It's complex enough as it is. I'm telling you, the first time I went to California State Department of Education and I was like, can you please explain to me what's going on here? And they started sharing. We have this statewide agency, and then we have counties, but we also have regions, and the regions and the counties are not the same. And then there are the districts, but there's also this, and then there's that, and then there's this. And oh, by the way, there are other entities who also have a lot of impact, like CCE, and so on and so forth. And I was like, who invented this mess? How are we supposed to show up in a meaningful way with this level of complexity when we don't even have a good understanding of what the different exchanges are or where these boundaries for conversations are? That in and of itself is really complex. However, in my view, it's not an adequate map, even closely, to a proper ecosystem. And I was thinking about, so what's the equivalent of, grazers passing by or migrating species or microbes or fungi or whatever? What's the equivalent of that in a human ecosystem? And one thing is, of course, that we have, I should say this first. So one thing is that we're talking about all these in causal loop diagrams, right? Which is great way of explaining how things stand in relation to each other and how they are impacting each other. But if a feedback loop, however we're trying to make things not nonlinear and when mapping things, there's still a mechanistic way of having some level of understanding of cause and effect. And that trips us up every time. Because first off, all of these systems, all of these entities in the systems are intergenerational. All our parents went to school. All our grandparents went to school. Everybody has an integrated mental model of what education is. And we live by that. So we have an understanding over generations that this is what school is supposed to be, which is one of the reasons why it's one of the most rigid damn systems in the world, right? It's internalized in everyone. And then it looks and feels differently, right? Because I came from this neighborhood, I came from this country, I came from this religion, or I came from this particular tradition. And so not only have we internalized something that for most of us of a particular age at least means sitting in lines, in rows, teacher in front of the classroom talking at us, and we're supposed to be empty vessels learning all kinds of things. Didn't work out for all of us, I'm just saying. But that's, basically, and then, of course, it looks and feels differently in different countries, but there is a kind of a particularity to when you say the term, when you name school or you talk about education, it'll immediately evoke a pretty fixed mental model with most people. Now, that is passed on. So my understanding of school is passed on to my kids. Yeah, you're not supposed to have fun, you're supposed to learn math and science. And of course, from a societal level, well, everybody has to have an education. That's why we're so focused on college to career readiness, because we want to make sure that everybody has a proper education. We forget, however, to talk about what would you like to do in your life? What would make sense to you? What would make you thrive and flourish and become a productive member of society? That conversation we've somehow taken out of the equation in the hope that education in and of itself can fix things. And then, in the families, of course, well, how I experience school, my kids are supposed to experience school, and that's why we see over time that it's so hard for people in most countries to break the social boundaries of, the level of education that your family has is usually the level of education that you end up in as well, because there is this intergenerational sense and understanding of it. And that, of course, goes through the whole system here. Now, that's one thing. The next is, of course, that it's emotionally nested. And this is where it gets really tricky. This was the simplest way I could think of how to somehow show this. Because what does that even mean? It means we're really emotional creatures, all of us. And, we have different relationships in all these kind of, different dynamics. And when we talk about it as nested, it means even though I, as a parent, say I have 2 children, my emotional stance towards the 2 of them will be different. I don't relate in exactly the same way to both of my kids. And now I'm a student and I have 5 different teachers. I have different emotionality towards each of these teachers. In the classroom, I relate to the classroom in a different way. I have a different concept of school, and maybe I like my out-of-school program, but not my school, and so on and so forth. And then it adds to the complexity, of course, that it's not just the concept, here at the district level, well, the school relates to the district. Yeah, that's not entirely true, is it? It's the people at the school that relates to the people at the district. So there's one person that I really like, and once I speak to this person, I kind of like the interactions with the district. But for most of the time, all these others out there are just, they're out to get me, and they don't understand me, and it's a compliance orientation, and so on and so forth. This level of complexity, this layer of the complexity is where so much emotional toxicity arises. Because it's completely opaque for us who's in charge of what in this grander map of the ecosystem, the only way we know how to relate to that, because we're not trained as systems thinkers and systems centers, is to put it out on people. They're not in it for the right reason. They just want me to comply. And for some people it's true. For some people that is actually the case. That's the kind of level that we've understood how to function at, and it's painful, and it's causing suffering, and it's not producing the outcomes we would like to see. And I'm looking at a lot of you in here who have been in the receiving end of this, and also in the producing end of this, because it's very hard to avoid if we don't have more of a sense of what on earth is going on in all of this. Now, what can we do? How can we interact in a meaningful way in this complexity? Well, the only thing I know how to do, or what I would recommend and what I think is needed, is for us to develop the sense of literacy of where are my own emotions in all of this. And part of what we're doing with our systems awareness processes is that when we enter into spaces, when we try to engage in a meaningful way in what's actually going on, we have to have some level of clarity of our own system. I traditionally get triggered in this particular way. That's showing up now. It must live in the system. And try to dismantle my own emotionality, my own personal history from what my larger experience is, because we will experience it. We're empathic social creatures. We immediately pick up what's going on in any field. Now, we take it on because we don't know how to address or separate what's ours from what's existing in the field. That's part of the cultivation process that we need to engage in. That's why we need to engage in this contemplative interoceptive stance when we enter into systems, because otherwise we'll get completely damn overwhelmed with all of these layers of emotions that exist between all these different entities. And the next one, because this was not enough, the next one is that it's also kind of almost like a web or a wave or sea of meaning, right? So we talk about mental models and we tend to think that, oh, well, that's something that we hold in our heads, but it's not true. Mental models are basically the way in which we navigate the world, right? We constantly bump into things and then we make meaning of it. Now, all that meaning making exists in this field as well. Now, how are we supposed to talk about things when what I mean with classroom is very different from what you mean with classroom, and we think we're having a shared conversation? We don't even have ways to distinguish what is meant by one thing and what is meant by the other thing. And so we end up with more of a map that looks like this. This is probably more precise, and mapping an ecosystem of education. Now, what are we going to do with that? It's messy as all hell, and we have very, very limited understanding of how to operate in a meaningful way in spaces like this. Does that mean that we should just pack our bags and say, now we're not going to do that? Well, I think, it'd probably be easier to just pretend it's not like this and go back to the causal loop diagram and say, we're going to intervene in the system here and then pretend everything is going to be okay. But it's not going to produce the compassionate systems change over time. And we need that, right? We want to really create a different trajectory for the future of our kids, for our species, for our planet. So I don't think that there's any way around than having to try to figure out this mess. And part of what's beautiful about this next phase of the work is that we now have the opportunity to actually engage with all these different levels of the system in what we call the Site Development for Generative Social Field in California. In Ventura County, and as many districts as want to be part of that. In Humboldt County, as many districts who want to be part of that. In Newport Mesa School District in California, coming up in LA, and so on. And this is just the beginning, right? But imagine if we can begin to create some level of clarity of the interfaces of these different entities and have some level of understanding of, oh, intergenerational, emotionally nested, layers of meaning, so on, is also operating. Doesn't mean that we have to figure out every single thread. This will never become a reductionistic scientific endeavor. We can't do that. But we can have a lot more clarity in how we're operating in these spaces than we currently have. And that's what we're setting out to explore here. And that's why the design kind of based research is really important, because we're going to test out things. We've worked with many of you for the last 8 years with this compassionate systems framework. We can see that some of these elements really work for people. People start showing up differently. People, give us feedback that it has changed their lives and so on. And we see that the systems start to shift towards a little more clarity and a little more kindness. Now, if we can have a more rigor in how we're approaching that over time, then we might actually get somewhere. At least that's our hope and aspiration here. So when we talk about clarity, I like to just think of it very basically as we like to see things as they are. And of course, we can't see things as they are because, we're still interpreting from our own perspective and so on. But as they are also means that I know who I am as I'm seeing things. So I have some level of understanding of how this particular situation will land with me based on my own kind of understanding of myself. And of course, respond from an attitude of kindness and care. It makes people feel better. It makes ourselves feel better. It might be really high leverage compared to how simple it sounds, but we can make choices about that. We can make choices that when I'm in a situation where I feel conflicted, I feel triggered, I feel you did not treat me like I wanted to be treated, or somehow my own mental models start evoking things. I have confirmation biases telling me that it's exactly what it was before, and I get triggered into my traumatic experiences and so on. Happens for all of us. But if I can begin to discern what's actually going on in me right now? I kind of know these patterns. Might not entirely be what people were intending. And then I can come back in a mode of inquiry. I can come back in a mode of being like, I would actually like to relate in this and not create greater polarization. And if nothing else, kind of minimizing polarization in this day and age might not be a bad thing. So we talked about in our design meeting back in September, what's the kind of toolbox? And I'm not sure I really like the word toolbox because it refers to a very mechanistic understanding. But I will say that all these awareness and practices of all of these three levels, so my systems awareness, my kind of orientation to the relational, my systems understanding, my sensing, all of that will become, lack of a better word, the toolbox or the kind of, the practices, the MIT practices for systems well-being. And that's probably what we're all aspiring to, much greater well-being in our systems, generally speaking. That was that. All right. So whenever you're ready, floor is open. We have about 10, 15 minutes or so. Josh. Hi, Josh. Look, there's a mic coming your way. Nice to see you too. Welcome.
I'm guessing it's there under the surface, but I didn't hear it mentioned. A lot of the qualities you described in the systems awareness portion remind me of pieces of BIPOC communities and knowledge and practices in BIPOC communities, indigenous and African American communities. And I wonder if you you have thoughts or remarks about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Josh. I think actually our greatest example is from the work that we've done in British Columbia and how this doesn't become reinventing the wheel that's existed there for thousands of years. So there's so much wisdom in traditions all over the world that we've lost by and large, not lost entirely, but that we, in this mindset of dominating nature, of nature being dead and has to be controlled, and we can harvest resources and we don't have to give back and so on. And that entire mindset that has been, shaping education for the last many hundreds of years, not only has it been neglected, it has also been ridiculed. So the opportunity to stand here today saying, hey, some of that stuff that if I had said these things like 20 years ago in an academic setting, I would have been booed out of the room. But we're somehow ready for something else. Because I think, at least for people in this room, I would assume that there is a kind of a shared sense of urgency. We actually need to get our act together very differently from how we've been operating over the last many centuries. So I appreciate that, and yes. And what we do is we try to learn as much as possible. Beauty about science is, of course, that we have developed rigorous processes of studying impacts of things over time, and we really want to do that. But we do not want to say that science shows you that this is the real thing. We want to be very respectful of the wisdom holders in various traditions that have known this all along, that the sense of belonging and how I relate to the earth that I'm on is essential for who I am as a human being, for example.
Would it be okay if I responded very quickly?
Sure.
I guess I react a little bit to the idea of urgency, particularly with respect to other cultures that have a different sense of time than we do. That in interacting with organizations that are working from different backgrounds, they seem to have a much longer view than we do, and this idea of urgency to fix may be actually part of the problem, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. The sense of that things need to be fixed certainly is, but I do think that for those of us who are in close proximity to kids who are really struggling, and we see that even in British Columbia, as we talked about, the finest social emotional learning that has been rolled out province-wide ever in the world, and kids' mental health and well-being is still declining rapidly, something needs to be done. So that's the urgency that I'm trying to address, not the quick fixes. Yeah, thank you. Claudia?
Thank you. Maybe connected to that, what I wrote, I think the thing that stuck with me was this idea of like how you have a conversation with kids about what they want to do in the future, what that is not imposed. I feel with that comes we underestimate how kids can understand this urgency you talk about. Like, how do we bring a balance so they can choose knowing that what they choose has an impact in the world? So I don't know if you can speak a little bit about that. Like this idea of like, they can choose their future, but part of what they have to keep in mind is the consequences and where we are. So that understanding, I feel, is necessary for the kids to choose. So how do you find the balance that is, they can understand the urgency because it's imposed in them, and then mental health becomes an issue, but they also might make a decision that has an impact in the future. Like what do we do when kids do not want to pursue higher education, when they don't want to engage? So I worry about with this future in terms of, and maybe the career and jobs is not the right framing, but in the future of the world, how do we engage kids in that conversation? And maybe this big system that you have painted for us. So.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think two things. One is, I think our orientation as the kind of adult, knowledgeable people in modern societies is, we see kids being anxious and depressed and freaking out and not functional, and they get all kinds of diagnoses and I don't know what. And we place it on them as individuals. We say, take this pill or go through this therapy or both. My sense is that it's an absolute adequate response to a totally unsustainable future of society that we put them in. So kids that are sensitive to what does my future look like, while we're desperately trying to teach them that the world is going to look exactly the same as it did for your parents, and you should get your education, and most of the degrees we have won't even work in the future, right? And if I'm supposed to migrate on a boat because my country is flooded, why am I needing this anyway? And those kinds of questions. So I think getting real with what's actually moving is the first point. And then I have concerns always because I'm super biased, of course. I think that this compassionate systems framework holds some elements not only for getting to know yourself and understanding how you operate in relations, but also having kind of methods for exploring interconnectedness and interdependencies and understanding more complex systems is essential for beginning to make rightful decisions about how I want to show up in the future, who I want to be in the future. Because if we don't know what's possible for us, if we don't hold these methods and practices, it's very hard to get anywhere. We can just kind of get stuck in a space where I don't want to engage. And that's what I think we're seeing. In fact, I saw, and I don't know, I mean, there's probably a lot of different different views on this, but one of the great trauma experts, actually also from British Columbia, from UBC, Gabriel Mette, had an understanding of ADHD. He said, well, it's nothing to do with kids now, having a deficit in their brains. It's because they learn it as a coping strategy, because there's so little connection that they can relate to, so they tune out. What does that mean? Well, it means, I can't engage with this, so we call it attention deficit disorder. It's a coping strategy. And, it might not be true for all, but I think while we see the increase in all these diagnoses, that might actually be very real. So addressing what we would call the underlying structure, actually going to the depth of what's going on, I think is primary for all of these conversations. Yeah? A mic.
Oh, thanks. So I struggle to express this in the right way. So There's about 8 billion people on the planet, and increasing. And I'm sure, and from my personal experience coming from Jordan, but I'm sure from all over the world, there are pockets, big pockets, of communities where children grow up in very different ecosystems than the ones described or the ones that we all relate to in this room, who actually are much closer to the vision that you're describing than we could even imagine. The problem is that they are being destroyed in the name of modernity, globalization, whatever, civilization, becoming developed versus developing,
Yes.
right? Yeah, all those quotes. My fear is that as you are rediscovering the wisdom here in the modern, the developed, whatever, the quotations, how do we prevent that going over to them to also reclaim them, telling them, this is the way, we're telling you how to do it. You see what I mean? Because this is one small pocket, California, Vancouver, but there's millions out there. So how do we remain humble and not to appropriate them again in the name of what they already had? And I think that's a very dangerous, very sensitive, and unless they're in the room with us, all of them, or we go to them, actually, they shouldn't come here, then we can really move forward and true systems change at the global level. And it doesn't just become another iteration of globalization with a hegemony from global south, north again.
No, I totally agree. Thank you, Raina. It's a very, very important point. And recolonization, that whole mindset that created this education path, in the name of doing good, right? My religion is better than your religion, so now you have to do my religion because otherwise you can't be a member of society. I mean, all of these things is a treacherous territory because we've deeply internalized these structures. So that's part of why we need to wake up and smell the coffee, in a sense. We need to actually unlearn how we've learned to operate, and I know that you'll be talking about some of this as well. And part of the reason why we're so intrigued by working with Humboldt County, for example, is because it holds the largest population of indigenous people in the state of California. So that's a good starting point. Part of the conversation in BC now is there is an independent nation, Niska Nation, which is a claimed territory of the First Nations people, who are willing to explore with us where we can both benefit. And that's the attitude that we need to bring, right? Because obviously, science might be helpful for all these other communities as well. In fact, I don't think we can get very far if it doesn't somehow become, also expressed in a terminology that many more people will adhere to. I don't think that there is a chance that these communities are going to survive in a meaningful way if we can't be of support. But it's the being of support for the integral wisdom and knowledge that exists. And then lastly, I would say, I should probably have set that right up, any ecosystem on this planet becomes vastly more resilient when it holds greater diversity. So this is not about finding one thing that fits all. This is about figuring out ways in which we can nourish and cultivate diversity, and which we can honor all the variation in which this is expressed in various ways, and not pretend that there is one model that is better than all the other models. We would just be repeating the same pattern one more time.
Can I just comment a little? I totally agree, and I just want to add, I totally agree. I just want to add that part of this disruption is even disrupting the concepts of support, disrupting the concept of we need to put scientific terms. I'm a scientist, I'm a professor of molecular biology, so I relate. But even that has to be disrupted if we want to ensure their survival. So that's a whole new thing we need to reimagine. And it's just to keep reminding ourselves that at every step to interrogate, am I doing as things are done, or I'm disrupting it at every level, in every step? That's all I just wanted to add.
And that's why it has to be in dialogue, right? So what is meaningful in this interaction? And it takes a few rounds before we even can get to that point, because obviously we have to have enough understanding of what we're entering into, and it's really helpful when people are also in understanding of what it is that we're trying to create and work with, and then we can have a kind of a dialogue. So right now, for example, in our our current cohort of master practitioners, we have a lady who's a principal in the Niska Nation who we are in an active dialogue with. We're like, okay, so how would you explain this in your culture, and what does it look and feel like, and so on. And there's tremendous overlap, obviously, as is kind of named by many in the room already. And our role is to not make ours the right way of talking about things. So thank you. Thanks for bringing that in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hands everywhere. It's also there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we just create system within a systems? Because for me, like when we talk about education, NESAD is very complex, and then my logic is, it's like a paradox. I mean, how can we change the dynamics if we are actually part of that dynamics?
Yeah.
Where that dynamic actually operates based on certain mental model. And then if we need to change that, I think that I need to have a different mental model to change that. And sometimes if the system is too complex, maybe it's easier, like create a positive deviant. I create my own system to operate within or besides another system.
Yeah.
I mean, can I just do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment, because obviously when we look at something like this, if I could find it again. Oh, this is not what I'm looking for. Are my slides still there somewhere? Okay, so when we look at that whole, thank you. When we look at that whole, this whole model here, it's, and even this one, right? I mean, how are we supposed to navigate that? So I think it's a really relevant question, and it somehow relates to the whole notion of systems awareness in a way, because it's not as if we consistently at all times have to cultivate everything at the same time, but we have to hold an awareness that as we're operating in a micro pocket of the system, we're still in relation to the larger system. And what we're aspiring to is create some kind of cohesiveness, some kind of shared understanding across all these levels. And so the remarkable opportunity is that we actually are able to work with so many entities at the same time. Now that, to my knowledge, I've never seen that done before. I can't say that we have a fixed plan about how we're going to go about it, but our people who are going to be introducing the work and working directly with people at all these different levels, all of them are really trained in this work, deeply trained in this work, will operate from this model of bringing systems awareness into the space, and will have that orientation to the larger system that they're part of. And we've made sure that the people who will work with the teachers, the classrooms, the principals, the schools, the outer school, and so on, have that lived experience as well. So they've been teachers, they've been principals, they've lived in the systems, they've lived in the districts, and so on. So that there's a kind of a functionality of knowing how to operate within that system. And that's as much clarity we can somehow bring into the space for now. But it needs to be a continuous reflection of, I'm doing this little thing here, and the world is out there, and there's some kind of dynamic between the two, and how can I create more clarity and more kindness in that relation as well? That's the big question, so thank you. Yeah, several hands.
Great conversation. And this is a conversation that takes time, and all of us in this space have a certain level of privilege to have this time, to have this moment. And I fear sometimes us having an aquarium-like effect where we're striving to make meaning of those that we serve. And I'm wondering, how are those that we serve making meaning and of all of this? And primarily serving students of poverty, people of color that have been disenfranchised or marginalized from the system. How can we slow down life enough in our schools and create the space in the moments where we work with our teaching staff and support staff to have the strategies to work with our students to create that dynamic exchange where we can find out what is the meaning and what are the needs that they need to be successful, and once I start looking at what is success look like in our school system, then I'm also a bit worried that our existing traditional school system needs to rapidly evolve in order for our students and families to thrive in this evolving world. And I think while we're worried that some of our high school seniors don't want to go on to college, we need to ask them why. And some of their reasoning might be accurate. So the systems of higher education also need to be nimble. And it seems like this deep awareness also requires an acknowledgement of the need for nimbleness, the urgency, but what are the varied levels of urgency depending on what bubble or name you represent on that ecosystem of education?
Yeah. It's a great question and a great comment, Cesar. And I mean, when we're working with systems, we're looking at ways to intervene in the system, right? And as has come out in many of the comments here, making sure that we're somehow not overriding any of the levels of the systems because we think we have the answer. Part of the reason why I thought it was poignant to develop this model is at least it can keep us humble, grounded in a reality that this is really complex work, and we can address it with a humble attitude of trying to be of best possible service for something that over time will create compassionate systems change, because we know that that is needed. It is needed in the world in general. And we can apply as much of our shared learning, insight, reflection, understanding, methodology as possible to this. But we can't develop a kind of, here's how we do it, point A, B, and C. That would be, I mean, how would we even begin to do that and still be real about what it would take? But just the fact that we're here at MIT with these people actually exploring this actively gives me great hope, because I think that there is a way forward for us. And only because all the right people are coming together in this conversation, and all the critical questions needs to come out, and all the experiences, the shared experiences from people need to be held in the space as well. Because it can't be, here's the scientific way of changing a system. We tried that, it doesn't work.